Welcome to New York's Champlain Barge Canal, Lock 5 Island, near Schuylerville. This is the site of Hudson Crossing Park where for over 20 years dedicated volunteers have been growing an educational and recreational destination. Come and have an adventure here. It's not a municipal park. It is maintained by volunteers and relies on your donations to keep the park available for everyone to enjoy. This presentation will share folklore and historical stories from across our region and, in some cases, introduce you to heritage tales not found in most history books. Compiled by Mike Belkiewicz, a volunteer at Hudson Crossing Park in Schuylerville, and whose family has lived in Saratoga County since the 18th century, will be sharing many from his lifetime collection. Fortunately, we live in a historical resort, with a cornerstone being the Saratoga National Historical Park. Drawing visitors from around the world, the Battlefield Visitor Center Museum and satellite parks do a terrific job interpreting the significance of what happened here in 1777. This region is one of the most historic regions of our country. We take for granted, or perhaps haven't realized, we live in the foothills of the oldest mountain range in North America, the Adirondacks. The Hudson and Mohawk Valleys are the only natural gap in the Appalachian chain. Whoever could control these valleys would be able to control the Northeast. The Mahicans called this area Saratoga. To them, it meant hillside country of the quiet river. Their region extended from the Mohawk River north to about where Fort Miller is today. For thousands of years, during peacetime and wartime, our waterways have been an artery for travel. The Mahicans established a trail from Canada down the Champlain and Hudson Valleys through our county to the Mohawk River just east of Schenectady. It became known as the Saratoga Trail. Along this trail in the village of Victory, the National Park Service discovered a 7,000-year-old community fire pit. First used by the Mahicans and then the Mohawks, it was likely that they dried fish here to be saved for food during the winter months. A few local historians believe it was also a First Nations trading point because some regional artifacts appear to have been made using materials not readily available. In 1609, two world-renowned explorers made discoveries in our backyards within miles of each other. It's fun to consider what might have happened if they had both met, but Samuel D. Champlain was here in July and Henry Hudson in September. Henry Hudson sailed the Half Moon up a river looking for a passage west. Below present-day Albany, Mahicans welcomed him and gave him furs. Seeing water entering the waterway from the west, he followed that stream and became grounded on a delta of the Mohawk River. Tides helped free his ship, and he continued up the Hudson River to Half Moon. A legend says that when you hear thunder, it's really the sound from Henry Hudson's men bowling. Washington Irving wrote a tale about Rip Van Winkle encountering ghosts of Henry Hudson's men partying and playing nine pins. The Dutch loved playing the game, but competitions often became confrontational, so much so that Connecticut passed a law making it illegal to play nine pins. Undaunted, the Dutch added a pin, and bowling has had 10 pins ever since. About 70 years after Jacques Cartier navigated the St. Lawrence River, Samuel D. Champlain arrived in Canada as a French ambassador to assist the Huron in defending their territory from Haudenosaunee raiding parties. He and his men accompanied a group to Crown Point over a beautiful lake he declared, along with all of its tributaries, French. A Haudenosaunee raiding party was shocked when Champlain and his men used their pre-flintlock guns called arquebus. Legend tells one of his crew spotted a creature with the head of a horse swimming in the lake. Today we call it champ, but some think they simply saw a long-nosed gar. Yet, Unauthenticated stone carvings at the northern part of Lake Champlain seem to identify a strange creature. What may have been retaliation for the experience with Champlain at Crown Point, Mohawks from near Amsterdam raided Canada in 1642 and captured a Jesuit priest. Father Isaac Jugs was brought back to their home and tortured. He was forced to accompany the Mohawks on a trip to Albany the next year, when he escaped thanks to a ransom for him that was paid by the Dutch. Jugs returned to France and, in 1646, was sent back to make peace with the Mohawk nation. During his return, he used the Saratoga Trail to reach the Mohawk River. Isaac Jugs was very likely the first European to see the Hudson Crossing Park region when he passed by to take Fish Creek along the trail. Long before the French and Indian War was declared, the near depletion of pelt-bearing animals and territorial disputes resulted in hostile raids between the Haudenosaunee and the French-supported Hurons. These conflicts were known as the Beaver Wars. English and Dutch frontier residents who were non-members of either party often suffered. In August 1689, 1,500 Mohawk warriors launched a surprise attack against the small settlement of Lachine at the upper end of Montreal Island. French retaliation for the Lachine massacre was carried out in 1690 when the settlement of Saratoga was attacked. Encountering blizzard conditions, the raiding party followed the Saratoga Trail to the Mohawk River. In February, the unguarded settlement of Schenectady was attacked. Most of the homes were destroyed, and most of the inhabitants were killed or captured. In 1747, a similar raiding party found themselves at rapids in the Hudson River known as the Saratoga Falls. The raiders used the sounds of the swift water to hide noises they would make crossing the Hudson. They accomplished their goal of attacking Fort Clinton and the settlement of Saratoga and brought 109 prisoners back to Quebec. Today, walking the Eagle Point Trail at Hudson Crossing Park, you can repeat history and listen to the rapids long before you get to a point where you can see them. During this period of conflict, Peter Kalm, a naturalist, was selected by the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences to travel to North America to collect seeds and plants that would thrive as cash crops in the cold Scandinavian climate. Here, you see his drawing of the Cohoes Falls, but Kalm was the first to provide Europeans with a scientific description of the falls at Niagara. During his travels, he questioned if the red and white clover he saw was always here or imported. Locals said it was always here, but members of the First Nations he met told him the clover was imported. Communities in these valleys lived in a no-man's land as two world empires clashed. When the French learned of English plans to attack forts along the borders of New France in 1754, they declared war against England. This act initiated the 7 Years' War, commonly called the French and Indian War. Forts and communities on both sides became targets, making the Champlain and Hudson Valleys major battlegrounds. Not far from Saratoga, the English win at the 1755 Battle of Lake George was countered 2 years later when the French destroyed Fort William Henry. In retaliation for the loss of Fort William Henry, the English assembled 15,000 troops at Albany to travel north on Lake George to Ticonderoga and attack Fort Carillon. Outnumbered, French General Montcalm, who had captured Fort William Henry in 1757, mounted a brilliant defense resulting in so many casualties the British retreated to Fort Edward. Finally, in September of 1759, British General James Wolfe's troops successfully attacked the city of Quebec and defeated the French forces under the command of Montcalm. Both generals were fatally wounded during the battle, but the victory ensured British supremacy in Canada. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 provided Great Britain with enormous territorial gains in North America. However, disputes over frontier policies and paying the war's expenses ultimately led to the American Revolution. After fearing raids for 3/4 of a century, our valley was finally peaceful. But for how long? England's financial problems and the expense of the victory over France, compounded by Parliament's long-distance management and controlling demands, lit a fuse of discontent across the colonies. It exploded in April 1775 when British soldiers tried to collect arms outside of Boston in the little communities of Lexington and Concord. That day, resistance turned into revolution. A month later, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga. While the British soldiers occupied Boston, colonial soldiers took positions overlooking the town. George Washington joined his young army and quickly realized the need for artillery. Knowing Forts Ticonderoga and Crown Point had cannons, Washington dispatched Henry Knox to transport artillery pieces from the forts on Lake Champlain to the heights overlooking Boston. Knox arrived at Ticonderoga on December 5th and, despite incredible difficulties, delivered 59 pieces to Washington on January 25th. Seeing the artillery in place, the British were forced to leave. 11,000 redcoats and royalists evacuated Boston on March 17, 1776. British regulars invaded Manhattan Island that August. A relay chain of royalist couriers was established to maintain communications with Montreal. Harry Bain's link was between his home in Argyll and Albany. One day, he received a message in the usual little capsule container. His wife, worrying he'd get caught, made biscuits to place the container in one she undercooked to preserve the paper message. On his way to Albany, Harry was stopped and interrogated by hungry patriots who began eating the biscuits from his bag. Satisfied with his answers, they threw the bag at him and said he could continue. When it was safe, Harry looked inside the bag and discovered that none of the men wanted to eat an undercooked biscuit. Harry Bain continued his service to the Crown and was never caught. In the late summer of 1776, brilliant resistance at Valcour Island and reinforced Forts Ticonderoga and Independence repelled a British attempt to control our valleys. The following summer, General John Burgoyne implemented his plan to descend Lake Champlain, take weakened Fort Ticonderoga, and continue south while Barry St. Leger's force would secure the Mohawk Valley. If successful, joining together in Albany with the British already occupying New York, Britain could end the rebellion by cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. When Fort Ticonderoga's garrison abandoned the fort, Burgoyne was optimistic that he'd reach Albany easily, not realizing that General Philip Schuyler's force, plus many who escaped from the fort, were blocking roads with felled trees, destroying bridges, and creating marshes that would slow Burgoyne to only 1 mile a day. Burgoyne assumed royalists would join his ranks to fight. Some did, but he gained refugees seeking protection from patriots harassing them. Slow movement and growing numbers of people generated the need to ration supplies. Hearing of a poorly defended American supply base in Bennington, Vermont, Burgoyne sent Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum with a mostly German force to capture animals and anything useful that might be stored there. Officials in Vermont, anticipating British moves, had assembled militia groups from neighboring colonies led by General John Stark. The Germans were a few miles from Bennington, and seeing a larger defense force than expected, they took to nearby high ground. General Stark had his units moved to positions encircling Baum's camp. When ready, Stark ordered the attack. The Americans were victorious, costing Burgoyne a major portion of his troops and no relief from the need for supplies. Colonel Baum was mortally wounded in the battle and died 2 days later in Bennington. While Burgoyne's army was slogging its way through ruined roads, Haudenosaunee raiding parties were terrorizing outlying communities. In Argyle, the entire Allen family was killed. If the army crossed the Hudson, they would be cut off from their support lines. Without relief from the raid on Bennington, the army was forced to wait for shipments of supplies. In the meantime, on the heights above the Bemis Tavern, the Americans were building fortifications to block the British advance. To march 6,000 troops and followers across the river, Burgoyne had Lieutenant John Shank design a bridge supported by bateaux and barges. Spacing them like floating trestles connected with wooden beams, planks laid across them became the roadway. Ramps were prepared, and when the army was ready, it crossed with dry feet. About this time, across the river from Saratoga, was Easton, a peace-loving Quaker settlement. After the Allen family massacre, officials met with the Quaker leaders to recommend they move to Albany for safety. The community decided to stay because they were not a threat to the approaching army. During one Sunday service in September, a band of Mohawks approached the meeting house. A congregation member explained to the Mohawk leader that this was an assembly of peace-loving people praying to their Great Spirit and invited the group inside to join the service. Both groups shared quiet time and some food, after which the Mohawk leader stood up and placed a white feather on the door to show other raiding parties that this group should not be harmed. Once Burgoyne's army crossed the Hudson, the American forces had less than a week to complete their fortifications, strategically placed at the heights above the Bemis Tavern. On September 19th, General Morgan's men ran into a group of British. A battle started, and reinforcements from both sides continued fighting until the end of the day when the Americans withdrew. 3 weeks later, Burgoyne launched a reconnaissance in force to find a weak point in the American defenses. This group was stopped and fighting raged back to the British redoubts. The fall of a northern redoubt after an attack led by Benedict Arnold placed the entire British camp in danger. Burgoyne was forced to retreat to Saratoga. By October 10th, the British Army was establishing campsites around present-day Schuylerville. Burgoyne's main camp was on the hill where the Saratoga Monument stands. Philip Schuyler's home and most of his buildings in the area were burned to prevent their use as fortifications. The British Army, now only about 5,000, was soon surrounded by 12,000 American regular and militia companies. A relentless siege by the Americans began, eventually leading to a ceasefire allowing surrender agreements to be drafted and finalized. On October 17, 1777, a British army surrendered for the first time in world history. Some members of the defeated complimented the discipline of the victorious soldiers, but legend says Yankee Doodle was played while the British Army marched by. This photo of the old Champlain Canal near Loch C5 shows the stone dust bike trail that runs on top of the original towpath used when the canal opened in 1823. General Philip Schuyler's grandson arranged for a basin to be dug near the Fish Creek Aqueduct to allow boats to dock and turn around. Located in a natural intersection of two mill-friendly waterways, the basin turned the area into a commercial port. Local farmers could now have new markets. Soon, warehouses, hotels, stores, homes, and new factories were built. The resulting community was incorporated as Schuylerville in 1831. Today, the towpath trail is part of the New York State Empire Trail, which links over 750 miles of similar trails. The junction of the Erie and Champlain Canals, pictured here, occurred south of Cohoes at a community called Juncta. The red line shows the path of the Champlain and the blue the elevation of its hand-dug ditch. You will notice the long stretch between Stillwater's Loch 9 and Northumberland's Loch 10. The longest in the canal, it ran for 16 miles. The two light blue ovals locate the Mohawk and Hudson River crossings. Often stone bridges called aqueducts were used to carry the canal over waterways, but here the canal boats crossed the current slackened by a dam, as towing animals crossed over a bridge. When the canal opened, roads were usually plagued with ruts and potholes. The constantly level canal provided smooth travel for both passengers and cargo. A speed limit of 4 miles an hour and the stamina of mules made them ideal for towing canal boats. Passengers riding on packet boats preferred horses to be used because they would usually walk faster. However, horses would tire more quickly than mules and need changing more often. On a road, a team could pull a wagon carrying about 2 tons of goods. On water, the same team could pull a canal boat that could hold up to 50 tons of cargo. Dams like this one were used to slow the river current and sometimes provide power to mills. At the far end of the dam is Hudson Crossing Park's Eagle Point, where Lock 10 would have joined the river with the canal. Before the lock, a small bridge would carry the towpath over the canal to continue the path along the western bank of the river. At the upriver bridge, tow animals would cross the river pulling boats across the current to the next lock. At the location of the original Lock 10 stands a reproduction lock tender's shanty that was built by Schuylerville High School's shop class using approved plans for authenticity. Starting in Vermont's Green Mountains and flowing to the Hudson, the Batten Kill River provides great potential for milling. In 1804, Job Whipple and his son-in-law, William Maury, built New York's first cotton mill to produce thread using water-powered single spinning wheels. Spools of thread were then distributed to nearby farms where the household would use their looms to produce fabric. When Maury wanted to increase production to compete with more efficient mills in Great Britain, he and a mechanic traveled to Manchester, England, and sneaked into a cotton mill one night. While there, the mechanic studied the mill's double spinner. Caught, they were kicked out of the country, but back home, were able to reproduce the spinner and double their production. During the 1800s, new markets resulting from the Champlain and Erie Canals led to 14 textile and paper mills being established using Battenkill and Hudson River power in the town of Greenwich. Additionally, many grist and sawmills were also located along their tributaries. Over the years, the Saratoga Monument has displayed several cannons. On July 3, 1902, an explosion made residents think Stark's Knob, once believed to be a dormant volcano, had started to erupt. Windows were shattered, babies woke up crying, and when officials and neighbors ran to Broad Street to everyone's surprise, there stood an abandoned Saratoga Monument cannon. There were no signs of how it got there and no evidence of the culprits who managed to move this cherished piece of artillery from the top of Burgoyne Hill to Main Street. This mystery plagued everyone for many decades until a man shared that he was the last of 4 friends that had sworn to secrecy. He told how they struggled to roll the gun down Burgoyne Hill and, when finally on Broad Street, loaded it with powder and just about anything they could think of. They inserted a special handmade fuse and lit it. When everyone gathered to see what happened, the 4 joined the group and acted as surprised as their neighbors. The key to their success and to establishing an alibi was that the fuse was made so long, it let each of them run home and climb into bed before the cannon fired. On the west side of the river, halfway from Lock 10 to the bridge, you will see a brick house with the word bank near the roofline. That was where Jesse Billings ran his farms and businesses. Jesse's enterprise included beef, pork, potatoes, ice, new and used canal boats, and a general store. He would take time payments when you purchased a boat. It said Jesse's assistant would watch the towpath to collect a payment if you passed by. Ice harvesting was a big business. The state would lease allotment acres of frozen river. The areas closest to ice houses were more expensive than allotments farther away. Jesse would rent cheaper distant allotments, and when ready to harvest, have his workers cut a channel through other leased ice to get to his space. When Jesse was sued by the other allotment holders, his lawyer used a defense that the others' ice was a hazard to navigation and a restraint of trade. Billings won and kept the ice his workers harvested from the channel they made through the other allotments. As bad a practice as it was, the use of enslaved individuals was common across all levels of society until slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1865. On the day the Allen family, from Argyle, was massacred, in 1777, they had borrowed 2 slaves from a neighbor to help them with their harvest. Wealthier people like Philip Schuyler included enslaved help to his workforce in his mills, farms, and in his home. Runaways were common from the start of enslavement. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 guaranteed a right for a slaveholder to recover an escaped slave. It included an extradition clause for the return of fugitives from justice and persons escaping from the service of their masters. As a result of this act, masters would sometimes offer rewards for the return of their property. Abolitionist newspapers and anti-slavery groups suggested runaways use the Champlain Canal and the Old Coach Road, currently New York Route 40, as a path toward freedom. Quakers, living in the town of Easton, and Greenwich residents offered many friendly destinations for runaways. Job and Esther Wilbur were Quakers living along the Old Coach Road. They were hiding a runaway when a hunter came to search their house. The former slave grabbed a knife and went up into the attic. When threatened by the runaway, the lone bounty hunter left to get help. Esther dressed the runaway in woman's clothes while Job hitched up their buggy. As soon as possible, Job drove the runaway to Greenwich and the home of Dr. Hiram Corliss, who was the Washington County Underground Railroad station master. The hunter lost the trail. Another time, Job and Esther helped an exhausted runaway named Frank. They nursed him as best they could, but his pneumonia led to consumption. The Wilburs suggested Frank have a last name and he should choose it. After thinking a while, Frank chose Quaintance. When asked why Quaintance, Frank said, "Because it was through the quaintance of this good Wilbur family that I am alive and comfortable." Frank's cane is still in the possession of Job and Esther's direct descendants. Frank told Job and Esther that the deer antler prongs helped twice to kill bloodhounds chasing him. The other end of the cane is charred from the rare times he could have a fire while on the run. The 1793 Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened by the Compromise of 1850 when slave states insisted that it require slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were caught in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. Halfway from Schuylerville to Lake George is the old Fort House in Fort Edward. Solomon Northup was a free black man who, as a child, lived in that house and was educated in local schools. Later, he moved to Saratoga Springs. In 1841, he was lured to Washington, D.C., where he was kidnapped, transported to New Orleans, and sold at a slave market. Finally, in 1853, he made an amazing journey back to his family. Being educated, he wrote a book about his story that inspired a 2013 movie, 12 Years a Slave. Free again and home, his kidnappers were arrested. 3 years after the case had barely proceeded, it was dropped in May 1857. The men who had kidnapped Northup went free. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. When traveling around and over the Cohoes Falls from Albany to Schenectady, a distance of 14 miles, your packet boat would lock through 27 locks. If you were first in line and could pass through in 20 minutes each, you'd spend 9 hours in locks and an additional 3.5 hours on the canal between them. It's easy to see why stagecoach lines between the two cities were very busy. Today, on the modern Erie Barge Canal, boats lift 170 feet, passing through the Waterford flight of 5 locks. Currently, that is the highest lift in the shortest span in the world. It is also greater than the lift along the entire Panama Canal. The increased stage traffic between Albany and Schenectady inspired the development of New York's first railroad. The Dewitt Clinton made its first run to Schenectady in 1831. The following year, a branch ran from Schenectady to Ballston Spa, and from there to Saratoga Springs in 1833. By 1870, Greenwich was connected to a hamlet on the Hoosic River by the Johnsonville Railroad. Schuylerville was not reached by rail until the Fitchburg Railroad planned to lay tracks in 1882. When Schuylerville residents on Green Street heard that a railroad track was planned for the middle of their street, they issued an injunction to stop the work. The rail boss knew that an injunction could not be served on a Sunday. So, on Saturday, the work crew gathered materials at the south end of the street beyond the village line, and on Sunday, the tracks were laid up the middle of the street and passed the village's north lines by Sunday night. The rails stayed there for 75 years. The water power potential of the Battenkill River and Fish Creek was recognized early as our region grew. Combining this natural resource with New York canals, making it easier to reach new markets and suppliers, milling linked to fast water boomed. However, in 1899, a 100 by 400-foot mill to produce wallpaper opened without the need of flowing water to run its presses. George Henry Corliss, son of the Underground Railroad station master, designed improvements that made steam engines more powerful and yet efficient enough to end mills' dependence on falling water for power. In 1903, towpath mules began to see competition when the Annex became the first steam-driven boat to be paid for pulling 2 boats the length of the Champlain Canal. Just before the turn of the century, in 1895, Schuylerville and Greenwich leaders worked together to establish an electric railway connecting the 2 villages. A trolley car ran over the tracks powered by a hydroelectric generator at the dam in Middle Falls. By 1901, the line was absorbed by the Hudson Valley Railway. The new railway carried passengers and packages from Albany to Warrensburg and points both east and west. Gas-powered vehicles and improved roads led to obsolescence of the electric railway, and by the late 1920s it ended service. The next time you visit Hudson Crossing Park, be sure to walk across the Dix Bridge. It feels magical to walk over the Hudson River and see it as it has been for hundreds, even thousands of years. Assembled in just 3 months in 1895, at the time, the bridge provided the only free crossing in the region while linking Saratoga and Washington counties. Because it was toll-free, the bridge was first known as the Free Bridge. Later it was renamed after local politician John Alden Dix, who served as New York State Governor from 1911 to 1912. The Dix Bridge is the cornerstone of Hudson Crossing Park. Visitors enjoy walking through history as they cross each of the 3 spans of this landmark. They look upstream to see remains of the American board mill where paper was made for the Liberty Wallpaper Mill. They see old trestles from the Trolley and Boston and Maine Railroad. They can imagine Burgoyne's troops crossing on their bridge of boats, and perhaps see Father Isaac Jogues in his gift-laden canoe or First Nations travelers on the Saratoga Trail. Annually, Hudson Crossing Park holds a benefit banquet by the bridge, celebrating it and the accomplishments of selected students and members of the community. Thanks for listening. We hope these stories add to your awareness of our regional heritage, and we encourage you to share them. Come and find your adventure at Hudson Crossing Park. Everything you see there was built for you through countless hours of dedicated creative people. It's not a municipal park. It is maintained by volunteers and relies on your donations to keep the park available for everyone to enjoy. Stay up to date about the park and our events by subscribing to our free monthly email newsletter or follow us on Facebook. Learn more at HudsonCrossingPark.org. When planning your visit, include a stop at the Champlain Canal Region Gateway Visitor Center in the village, where you will learn much more about interesting places throughout the Champlain and Hudson valleys.